皆様、本日は日曜日の朝にもかかわらず、たくさんの方にお集まりいただき、大変ありがとうございます。イベント開始までしばらくお待ちください。なお、今回の説明会では、聞く言語を選ぶことができます。画面の下の方にある地球儀のアイコンの通訳マークをクリックしてください。日本語で聞きたい方は、日本語を選んでください。その上で、オリジナルオーディオをミュートにしないを選んでください。英語の部分は英語のまま、日本語の部分は日本語のままで聞きたい場合は、オリジナルの音声を選んでください。それでは開始までしばらくお待ちください。皆様、イベント開始の時刻ですが、もう少々お待ちください。皆様、イベント開始の時刻となりましたが、もうしばらくお待ちください。あと1、2分ほどでイベントをスタートします。 皆様、大変お待たせいたしました。本日は日曜の朝にもかかわらず、オンライン説明会、アドバンスラーナーとはにご参加いただき、大変ありがとうございます。私、本日司会を務めさせていただきます、一般社団法人エデュケーションビヨンドの服部彩子と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いします。まず本日のプログラムのご案内です。この後9時10分頃から、米国ジョンズ・ホプキンズ大学のセンター・フォア・タレンテッド・ユース CTY より、エグゼクティブディレクターのエイミー・シェルトン博士からアドバンスラーナーについて講演をいただきます。9時30分頃からは15分の質疑応答を予定しています。皆様からのご質問は Zoom の Q&A で随時受け付けています。ご質問がある方は Q&A にご記入ください。時間の許す限り多くの質問にシェルトン博士及び当団体のメンバーがお答えしていく予定です。その後9時45分頃からこの冬に予定している当団体主催のプログラムについてご説明します。応募や選考、費用など詳しい説明をさせていただきます。なお、今回の説明会では聞く言語を選ぶことができます。画面の下の方にある地球儀の通訳マークをクリックしてください。日本語で聞きたい方は日本語を選んでください。そしてオリジナルオーディオをミュートにしないを選んでください。英語の部分は英語のまま、日本語の部分は日本語のままで聞きたい場合は、オリジナルの音声を選んでください。それではまず、当団体の戦略、財務を担当している小原より、エデュケーションビヨンドについて紹介させてください。小原さん、お願いします。
ありがとうございます。ただいま紹介に預かりましたエデュケーションビヨンド小原佳代子と申します。私の方からは団体に関しまして、その目指すところ、現状の取り組みなどについてご説明をさせていただきます。まず、エデュケーションビヨンドですが、2020年7月に設立をいたしました。コロナ禍で活動を一旦休止していた頃がございますが、2022年初旬にメンバーを新たに再スタートをした非営利の団体です。写真にございますように、現在約30名のボランティアメンバーが事業開発、マーケティング、IT 会計、法務人事など専門的なスキルを持ち寄って日々の事業運営を行っております。次。法人のミッションですが、エデュケーションビヨンドではアドバンストラーナーと呼んでおりますけれども、知能が高く、学校の一斉授業では物足りない知的好奇心が旺盛な子どもたち、通常ギフティッドとも呼ばれている子どもたちを中心に据えまして、彼らが自分の可能性を最大化できる社会の実現を掲げております。このミッション実現のためのビジョンといたしまして3つ。アドバンストラーナーが学びへの欲求を満たせる場の創出。それから保護者の方が情報を交換できるコミュニティ場の形成。そして、こうした子どもたちを理解した教育方法を模索している学校の先生方と現場で一緒により良い対応を考えていけないか。この3つを立てさせていただいております。時間はかかると思いますが、より多くの方のご協力を得ながら、ぜひ日本でこのようなことが実現できないかと日々活動をしております。その活動でございますが、現在4つの柱で考えています。お示ししている表の左から2つの柱は、先にご説明した1つ目のビジョン、アドバンストラーナーの知的好奇心を満たす場の提供となります。1つが法人独自のプログラムの提供です。2022年の冬から始めました自由研究型プログラムですが、過去3回開催しています。今後、新たなフォーマットも視野に入れて実施をしていきたいと考えております。もう一つが、外からアドバンストラーナー向けの先進的なプログラムを導入し、日本で提供をする活動です。2022年当初は、本日ご講演いただくエイミーさんがご所属のジョン・ホプキンス大学傘下の CTY のプログラムを導入することを検討しておりました。こちらに関しても引き続き進めてまいりたいと思っております。3つ目の柱ですが、 ビジョンの2つ目の保護者の情報交換の場としてのコミュニティの形成に対応するものとなります。現在、プログラム開催時には保護者会、もしくは子どもたちの研究に伴走するチューターが集う会などを対面で開催をしております。また、オンラインでのプラットフォームも立ち上げております。一番右端の4つ目の柱でございますが、アドバンストラーナーの認知向上活動です。こちらはアドバンストラーナーの保護者の皆様や学校の先生方などを対象とさせていただき、本日開催させていただくような、こうした子どもはどんな子どもで、どんな困りごとがあって、親や先生方はどんなふうに対応していただくのが良いのかについての理解を高めるための活動となります。次お願いします。こちらは先ほど触れさせていただいた法人独自の自由研究型プログラム、過去3回からの写真となります。子どもたちは毎回非常に面白い研究テーマ、例えば数学の分野では、コラッツ予想を解き明かそう、そして賞金を得ようというふうに考えて取り組んだお子さんもいらっしゃいますし、物理系の分野では、光の正体について実験などをして、考えていくようなこともございました。哲学的な課題では、生きる意味とはなどに取り組み、個別の研究であるとか、チームでのディスカッションなどを通して、最終日には研究成果を発表するということを行っております。最後にこちらのスライドは先ほど触れさせていただきましたコミュニティプラットフォームについてでございます。ウェブサイトとアプリケーションがリリースされまして、保護者間、それからチューター間、EB とのコミュニケーションが始まっております。長期的にこうしたネットワークが強化され、関係者のよりどころになるようなコミュニティになることを願っております。以上、簡単ではございますが、エデュケーションビヨンドの紹介とさせていただきます。司会の開始します。服部さん、よろしくお願いします。
はい、お原より当団体エデュケーションビヨンドについて説明させていただきました。次に、米国ジョンズ・ホプキンズ大学センター・フォア・タレンテッド・ユースエグゼクティブディレクターエイミー・シェルトン博士よりアドバンス・ラーナーとはと題して講演いただきます。エイミーさん、よろしくお願いします。Good morning, Amy, and it's maybe good evening in your time. And would you please talk about who advanced learners are and what they need? So please take the screen.
Yes, thank you. Get this going. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that okay. Thank you and good morning. I'm excited to be here and to talk to you a little bit about CTY, but more about advanced learners in general. And as was just said, who they are and what they need. And before I do that, I do want to give just a brief overview of CTY. For those who are not familiar with it, CTY has actually been around since the late 1970s. It was actually founded for the purpose that we're talking about tonight. That is, who are advanced learners and what do they need? And we have about almost 45 years of experience serving these students with a lot of different activities. So we do everything from the testing and identification to different kinds of programming. And we wrap all of that in research, with the idea being that our job is to better the field for these students. And we do that by differentiating the learning based on different needs of students. So that is what I hope to talk to you a little bit about tonight. I also want to point out that we are a global community at CTY. So although our home and our programming is based in the United States, much of our student population comes from all over the world. So we serve students from numerous countries. We do have, over the years, many international collaborations as well. And so we really do view ourselves as having sort of a global presence. And we're excited to be talking with you in Japan tonight. This morning. So I want to start by talking a little bit about advanced learners. I'm going to try and give you kind of an overview of the way we think about these students. And in English, there are a lot of different words that are used to talk about these students, including gifted, talented, high ability, high capacity. And each of those has multiple definitions depending on who you're talking to. So at CTY, we've really selected a particular category or type of language, which is to call them advanced learners. And so the definitions I'm going to provide for you are those that we use at CTY based on the literature, in the research, and the way that we treat our students. So how you think about them actually impacts how you serve them. So very generally, we can talk about what makes a learner advanced. And it's interesting because when you ask someone, they'll say, well, of course they understand. It's something very simple. It's students who are at the high end of academic ability. And that makes sense. So if this is a curve here of academic ability, whatever we want to say that means, it's those students who are in that little blue end, the people who are strong in doing this. But the problem with that is that we have to ask the question, ability to do what? And in what areas? And then how do you know that you have an advanced learner? And so the story is actually more nuanced. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about some of the tendencies, then talk about some of the variability and a bit on identification. So a lot of the time when we talk about advanced learners, people will say, you know it when you see it. And we ask these deep questions about what does that actually mean? You know it when you see it. Well, there are some characteristics and tendencies. And the reason I call them tendencies is you don't necessarily see this in every single student, but that in general, these are the kinds of different things that surface. Across students, what you see most notably is strong reasoning and problem-solving ability, meaning their skills in the area of solving problems and thinking through things tends to stand out. And in particular, those skills are unexpected for their age or grade level. So that's why we use the term advanced. These students also tend to be very strong at deep understanding of concepts. So you often find that in conversation with them, they're able to talk about things at a level that is deeper than what one might expect for their age or grade level. They have a tendency to do work independently. That does not mean do work alone. It is more about the approach they take to their learning. So it's a very different role for a teacher because this is a student who needs to kind of own their own learning and the approach to it. They tend to be very good at reflecting on their learning when asked, meaning an advanced learner will not only learn well, but can actually talk about the way in which they take in information and think about it. And one that's going to come up again and again is this is also a group of students who tend to be able to become very engrossed in the things that interest them. So we often talk about a student just digging deep into a topic. But when we talk about these characteristics and tendencies, it's really important to recognize that there's also a lot of differences among these students. So we talk about the diversity among them. The first being that they are found in every community and every demographic, meaning that advanced learners transcend racial, ethnic, cultural, economic, all of these other dimensions that they are found there. And that means when you're trying to serve them, you have to be aware of that. So serving a group of students who are advanced from Tokyo is probably quite a bit different from serving a group of students who are advanced from, say, rural Arkansas in the United States. And at CTY, we tend to have all those students coming together. And you just have to be very conscious of the fact that while they share their academic talent, they're going to differ on these things. Even within the academic talent, they also can differ. So for example, they can differ in the domain of exceptional ability. So very simply, in a simplified version, you can think about students having quantitative reasoning ability or verbal reasoning ability. And you can actually have students who might be strong in one and not the other. So for example, this student might be strong in quantitative reasoning, but is kind of typical on verbal reasoning. You can also have students who are strong in both. That is not unusual for us either. But the key is that the domain of exceptional ability, where you're advanced, is going to determine the kind of support that you need. In addition to having different domains, there are also different levels. So even though we can think about advanced learners as all being advanced, we've learned over many years that you actually have to break out that tail, that blue section actually breaks out into many different levels. And at CTY, we actually try to categorize students beyond saying you're just an advanced learner. We actually have 3 additional categories in which we place students. And that helps us to determine what kinds of supports they need. So even within the advanced learner space, there are different needs depending on where you are. And again, this is all for a given domain of ability. The other really important area in which they differ is they vary in their strengths and weaknesses broadly defined, as well as their interests and their motivations, meaning that you can have a student who is very strong in some academic area, but they may or may not be interested in it. They may have weaknesses in certain parts of their skill set that challenge them in some of these ways too. So understanding a student not as just being advanced in something, but rather understanding where they have strengths, where they have weaknesses, and how to serve those is quite important as well. They also differ along all the normal things that make humans different. So they differ in their social skills and their personality traits. So the things they bring to a classroom vary a lot and create it's not a one-size-fits-all for these students. And then another critical place in which they differ, which drives a lot of the way we think about supporting them, is that they differ in their developmental trajectories. And we talk about this as they can have asynchronous intellectual and social emotional development. And what we mean by that is that a student may be very advanced in academics, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be advanced in other ways. And oftentimes we make that error. So again, using sort of simple examples, if you can think about sort of some measure of maturity, how mature is a student, and think about their academic ability, we have a lot of students who are advanced academically, but are average with respect to maturity. So very much typical students. And that's very common. We can also have a student who is both advanced and more mature than we would expect for their age or grade. We can also have the other end of it. We can have a student who's very immature, but also academically advanced. And knowing that plays into how you think about serving them. In addition, we also can have something more extreme, which we refer to as twice exceptionality, where a student might be advanced, but may also have some sort of developmental or learning challenge that goes along with it. So, for example, it's not unusual to see an advanced learner who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder going on, where they have certain challenges that also are part of who they are and part of their learning journey. So that's sort of the quick version of who they are. And the key points to that are that they share this ability of being sort of the high end in one or more domains, but that they differ in both the domain and degree of advanced ability, as well as differing along a wide range of dimensions that are sort of in addition to their academics, but do affect the learning environment. Okay, so with all of that in mind, we can then talk about briefly how we identify them. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I do want you to be aware that this is actually one of the challenges. We spend a lot of our research time trying to understand the best way to characterize and therefore identify these students. And the typical approach is to use above grade level standardized testing. This typically means giving a student a test that is designed for an older student. And we tend to look at three areas: quantitative reasoning, verbal reasoning, and spatial reasoning, with the idea being that we can understand sort of what we might align to that. There is effort to break that down even further into things like scientific thinking and other elements. But for now, these are sort of the strongholds. And this is where a lot of testing has been. And this is very effective for students who have had access to strong educational opportunities in their life. They're very tied to, the first two in particular, are very tied to their academics. So quantitative reasoning and verbal reasoning have a strong curriculum focus. Spatial reasoning is a little bit different and is sort of a rising star in the field right now. At CTY, we're also, along with others in the field, looking at possible alternatives to this to broaden our ability to find these students and tie it more closely to what we really want to know, which is how they learn. So we've got projects looking at more fundamental cognitive skills like spatial reasoning, but also broadening that to others. And that's to look at it at a deeper sort of what are the underlying skills that might make someone really strong academically. And then the other projects we have going include trying to think about different ways to test. So we have a project on what we call our dynamic spatial assessment, where we're taking the spatial skill domain, but we're asking the question, what happens if instead of looking at just what you can get right and wrong, we look at your reasoning as it unfolds? So it's a very exciting and transformative project we're working on. I'd be very happy to talk with anyone about that at a later time if they're interested, because that's sort of the project we're really thinking will turn identification sort of on its head and become a much stronger area in the field of education. So that's sort of identification in a nutshell. And I can talk more later about what some of those tests are if people are interested. Now I want to turn the attention to what do we do? So if that's who these students are, what do we do to support them? What do they need? And I want to emphasize it's really important to think about it in terms of needs, because what we do know from the literature and from our own experiences is that academic abilities develop at different rates based on access to opportunities. So there's a longstanding myth in the world that these students are going to be just fine because they're so bright, they'll do well. But the reality is we have to support them. It really is about their needs. And so what do we know about advanced learners' needs? Well, I'm going to put this in a framework that comes from some work I've done with Solby Young, where we looked at what students are saying about what they value and what keeps them engaged in education, in their own education. So this comes from C2I students, but it turns out it's a very nice framework for organizing what we also know from the broader research literature. So the first thing we know about these students shouldn't surprise anyone. They need rigorous material. And what this means is students need learning situations that challenge them without too much frustration. So it challenges them, but that they can still do. And this is actually referred to as the zone of proximal development. And I want to share with you, for those who are not familiar, just a simple illustration of what that means, because it's a fairly straightforward concept that drives a lot of human learning, and yet we don't talk about it too much. So I'm going to use a visual example here, which is mountain biking. So let's imagine we have a typical mountain biker here, someone who's got a little bit of experience, is trying to get better, and wants to figure out sort of what's the right path to take that will give them some learning. Well, if this is sort of a typical mountain biker, they might take this first path, but it has very few barriers, very few curves. They can do it, but it might be too easy. There's not going to be a lot of learning going on. On the other end here, there's this really rough path. It's got a lot of barriers, a lot of bumps, a lot of twists and turns. This one actually, if you're fairly typical, might be impossible to complete. It might be too hard. And that's also going to limit learning. So what you're really looking for in any learning situation is sort of that just right path. So this middle one might be the right one for this cyclist because it's hard, but with some effort, it can probably be done. And that would be the idea behind the zone of proximal development. That's where learning is going to be maximized. It's challenging, but you can still do it. But now let's imagine we take the advanced learner concept and we say what we really have is some really aggressive mountain biker, someone who's really, took to it right away, is able to get past lots of barriers, but still needs to keep developing and learning. Well, we can be assured that that first path is too easy. And some of the things that are more typical challenges for the sort of typical mountain biker may also not be enough. And this is what we face with advanced learners, is that what we think of as sort of the harder paths may or may not be hard enough for that student. And that's where we have to think about differentiation. So again, the first thing we need here is challenge. And from the literature, there's some additional concepts related to this. One is that there is extensive evidence that students will thrive when given sufficient challenge in both content and approach. So both the material that you're providing needs to be somewhat advanced, and the approach you're taking to learning needs to challenge them as well. This is where you get that independent learning often, is that they need to take the learning into their own hands. Again, very different role for a teacher. Another area is that they found that there's a strong need for conceptual learning. We have a sort of a standard approach to learning in many spaces where we think about it as sort of delivering material, kind of like what I'm doing tonight, and doing a lot of sort of rote review and rote practice. That does not necessarily challenge an advanced learner. So getting into things that are more conceptual tends to be better. And then, as I mentioned before, these students do differ. And so appropriate differentiation is also really important. The second area is one that's very strong at CTY, which is a supportive peer environment. And this simply means students need to find other students like them, particularly with respect to their academic strengths. This helps build their self-concept and then validates their smart. So it's not ideal to be the solo strong student. You want students who are able to be strong together. Okay, oops, sorry. Let me go back a second. Oh, no, this is correct. Okay, sorry about that. I thought I got ahead of myself. We know from the literature that this is a really important factor. Students benefit from access to their peers. And what this means is that they need to be matched in their sort of near intellectual ability, that academic ability, bringing them together, and then also for being near in the social and emotional development area. This is why it's so important that we think not only about what their academic needs are, but sort of who their peer group should be. So for example, if you have a third grader who is performing like a seventh grader, we don't necessarily just say, put that third grader in seventh grade, because that may not be their social and emotional peer group. We need other third graders who are also performing like seventh graders. That's the peer group. They also like to, they also benefit from being around students who share their interests and their motivation to learn. So these tend to be fairly highly motivated kids when you get them in the right space. And their peer group tends to show them that they can be diverse on those other dimensions we mentioned, that it's not a one size fits all. You're not all just your academics, that you're a rich individual beyond that as well. And then the third area is fostering passions. And this is one that I think really plays into all kinds of things. Everything from how you handle your academics to things like college admissions are very strongly about passions. And fostering passions is really critical because we know that advanced learners can become very easily devoted to their interests. I mentioned before being engrossed. We know that they benefit from supplemental opportunities that are aligned with their interests. So we talk a lot about helping kids advance in school, but it turns out they benefit dramatically from experiences that are not necessarily about getting ahead in school, but that are fostering those interests, supplementing. We talk a lot about college level courses for students who are still in middle school, because that grabs them and lets them explore an interest that they can't explore in school. And the other thing about these students that's about fostering passions is that they do seek opportunities to apply their skills and their knowledge. So we really need to think about students not only in terms of their academic strengths, but also their passions and their weaknesses and those other areas that all come together. And then finally, one of the ones that we've worked closely on is the importance of novelty for these students. The sense of wonder that comes from something new, trying something new. And we've learned from some of our work and from others that novelty actually comes in two forms. The first is in the academic content. So bringing students content that they're not going to see in their regular classroom. Our most common cases of this are we do courses on epidemiology or cryptology, things that they won't see, or very advanced math concepts, things that are outside the standard curriculum. But the other side of novelty is the approach. And this is something we focus very heavily on at CTY and that we hope to bring more broadly to other domains. And that is really thinking about learning as an activity beyond the normal pedagogy. So a lot of things like we bring college style seminars down to as young as second grade, or thinking about project-based learning, very hands-on, lots of laboratories. Collaboration is another one that, at least in many of the schools we work with across the world, is not always as strong as it could be. And the heart of CTY learning has been facilitated learning. So many of these other things are really about the instructor or the teacher facilitating the students as they engage in the learning. And so this novelty kind of goes along with the academic rigor, meaning the rigorous academics and the novelty both really need to be sort of hand in hand, advancing the content and thinking about the approach itself. So that's sort of, again, a nutshell version of the various things that we know at this point that are sort of guiding ways to think about how to serve these students. And again, at CTY, these sort of serve as fundamental tools for us in our space, and we like to help others think through them and work on how they might fit in their space as well. So just to summarize what I just talked about in terms of what advanced learners need, what they really need is opportunities to develop. So our goal is to meet them where they are academically. That refers to the rigorous content, recognizing that they are at a different social emotional level, perhaps, than their academic level. So again, why we group kids by age and grade rather than saying, let's just keep moving them up. Helping them to discover their interests and passions. So a big part of what they need is the ability to explore, discover, and grow, not just along the normal academic tracks, but in their own personal space. They'll find those things. Continuing to engage them in their interests and passions. This is actually where we see the most drop off in advanced learners, is that if they're not able to engage, they will not stay advanced if not supported well. And then really building the support in the community. So cannot emphasize enough the importance of that peer community, because we know from the work that these students will not thrive, will not reach their potential if we don't support them with opportunities. And again, that's why we always go back to this is really about their needs as a student. And with that, I know we want to have some time for Q&A. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening and learning, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
Thank you, Amy. I understood that advanced learners are very different in age, and we need to show them different opportunities. So now we go to Q&As. それではここから質疑応答に移ります。皆様からの質問は Q&A で受け付けています。それではまず一つ目の、質問に参ります。アドバンスラーナーに対して認知が低い日本において、子どもがアドバンスラーナーの特性を持つと分かったとき、どのような学校を選んで、どのような学校や教員とコミュニケーションを取ったり、働きかけたりしたら良いでしょうか。その状況の中で親ができることは何でしょうかという質問になります。So, Amy, can you please answer this question?
Sure. And this is always an interesting question, because one of the first things you have to think about to answer this question is what kind of a school culture are you in? So we've worked with many cultures who are not yet ready to think about equity as something other than everyone gets the same thing. And so first question is always, are you in an environment where equity actually means giving each student what they most need? And so when you have evidence that a child has advanced ability, the first thing to do is to have discussions around what is that ability, what are the kinds of supports the student needs, and can you identify schools or other supports that will pay attention to that need. So the first is to really have conversations about what is the school culture. We are seeing more and more schools that embrace this idea that every student should be challenged. And that means not every activity will be the same for every student. And so in terms of what a parent can do to take action is start with that question. Start with the question of how does the school approach student needs? Do they approach it as sort of a one-size-fits-all? Or do they approach it more from the view of every student has needs? I will say education has struggled with differentiating for different students. That is true across the world. You can take the very best schools and they still struggle. But I think more and more having the conversation in light of student needs is a really important one. And then what I would say to parents also and educators, so it's not just the parents, but educators as well, need to be thinking about whether there are other opportunities out there. And these can be both opportunities in formal learning, like CTY offers, courses and programming, but also those informal settings. So oftentimes we tend to think that an educational opportunity needs to be advancing a student in school, needs to be giving them credit towards something. But oftentimes it's more about making sure that there's time for opportunities that are engaging and enriching, and those may include things that are in the informal space. So it's a little bit of putting together kind of an action plan for a student, and having the student be part of that is really important as well. Having the student engaging in what's going to help me get along. And that's easier as they get older, but even at young ages, having them part of the conversation can often help.
Thank you, Amy. And I have a question from the another person. アドバンスラーナーとして得意な分野を中心に伸ばすべきか、社会的な適合性を伸ばすような教育に触れさせたり、教えたりするべきでしょうかという、これ保護者からの、質問になると思います。Amy, can you answer this question, please?
Yes, certainly. And I would start by saying that this is never going to be either or. It's not going to be the case that you would focus on sort of just the educational strengths or the adaptability, because they really go hand in hand. So it's really about balancing what is a child's strengths and weaknesses, and where are those strengths sort of tied to their passions? How do we get them engaged in those strengths? but they also go along with figuring out what are some of the potential weaknesses, where are they likely to hit barriers because of this. So if you think about a student who is very singularly focused on, say, their math education, which does happen, we get students who are very singularly focused, they also need other things. They need to be able to communicate. They need to be able to get through the other aspects of their academic journey. And so thinking about it in light of both of those things is really important. And a lot of people say, oh, that means I have to do two different things. No, this gets back to the types of supports that you want to put in place. Having things that they do that are strengthening their interests and passions can actually have elements of, but you also have to do these other things. So it's a little bit, I always joke, it's a little bit of bargaining with a student too. We talk about like, you can do these things that you're very passionate about if we also make sure that these other things are happening as well. And I do feel like a lot of the maturity and adaptability has been lost in many years, certainly in the US version of how we've treated gifted education. For a long time, there was too much focus on accelerate and advance and move them up, and less on, well, yes, you want that content, but don't forget about that peer community. The social adaptability and maturity, a lot of that does come from having that strong peer community. So the more you can think about bringing these students together, the stronger that's likely to be.
So you need to communicate with these advanced learners a lot and take the balance.
Yes, yes. Meet them where they are. And again, as I said in the previous, having them be part of the process, having them be part of the selection of activities and supports. They can't do it all. And sometimes, yes, parents and educators have to be the guide, but it's also the case that they can participate in those.
Okay, thank you. エイミーさんありがとうございます。それでは次の、質問に参ります。特性が強く出ている。例えば、感覚過敏、情動が強く出る。によって、ストレスから偏食や蕁麻疹などのフィジカルな症状が出てしまっている場合は、親はどのような対応をすべきでしょうかということで、悩んでいる保護者様からの質問になります。So, Amy, please answer this question.
Sure, sure. Yeah, so I am not a mental health professional, and this really ventures into that space. However, what I can talk about is what we do know from extensive research, is that well-being is a critical aspect to learning. That's not to say someone can't succeed when they're having sort of challenges with things like stress, and we see a lot of perfectionism in these students. But managing that and attending to that is essential, because we know that they are going to do even better, succeed even more, if you can get those things under control. So though a child can be appearing to excel, if you know these things are going on, it is probably hampering their long-term success and learning. And so my best advice to a parent who is observing these things is a hard one for an advanced learner, which is seek help and have your child understand that seeking help is healthy, right? That is the right way to do it. You want to do your best to reduce the pressures on these students. They put enough pressure on themselves. And I think both in the US and in Japan and in many other countries, the educational system is a high pressure system for these students in particular. They know that they are bright often, whether we tell them or not. They often know, and their peers in school often know. They often know who's standing out, whether we say it or not. And that's stressful. That is, there's a pressure to do well. I am very, very smart, therefore I must change the world, right? So it's really on the educators and the parents and families to think about, how do we provide those supports? And when you get to the point where it's actually having physical manifestation, the thing that is most effective is actually seeking someone to work through that with you. And again, showing to your child that that is the healthy approach. And that's been, for some families, that is a challenge, right? You're used to being able to say, I should be able to handle this, I'm smart. And but the reality is we often, even as adults, can't. And therefore it's really critical to kind of think about support more broadly in that sense. But I would say attend to that. That is not something, because it's going to hurt the learning in the long run.
So parents should not take, I'm responsible for this and just seek for help, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it just happens, right? We're all in that boat. We all experience stress. And when kids experience, it's worse because they're still developing. And we know stress is harmful to development more broadly.
Okay, thank you. We can go for maybe one more question. 子供は年少期は学力は高いが、やがて追いつかれると聞きました。特性を成人後の仕事などに結びつけるためには、親はどのように子供に関わっていけばいいでしょうかということで、もう一つ保護者様からの質問になります。Amy, please answer this question.
Sure. So this gets back to that engagement and passions. It is true that someone will not stay advanced. They will not retain that advancement if they're not supported right. And a lot of that support really does come from both all of those things we talked about, the rigorous academics. But I think if I had to point to the thing that's most important is providing opportunities where a student can really engage in why the academics are interesting to them, what kinds of things, are they passionate about? So it's that fostering passions piece. And we say fostering, it's both discovering them and then supporting them and engaging in them and watching how they change over time. So I think this gets back to exposing children to opportunities, and particularly opportunities that show them the relevance of their academic ability in the broader world, helping them to kind of choose things in their world and those opportunities that really demonstrate what the world has available to them, and then being open to change. So oftentimes we get students on a singular path, like my kid is really strong in this area, so I'm going to make sure they get into engineering. If that student's taking a lot of different paths, but feels like they're stuck, they're going to have to be an engineer, that can also sort of limit their likelihood of doing that discovery, being creative, really thinking about opportunities. So the more parents and educators can expose students to the sort of wide world of opportunities and then help them to sort of choose things that are of interest and keep them engaged, then they'll find that path and they'll get to it much more naturally and in a way that they're much more ownership of it if they feel like they've been part of it.
So we need to show as much opportunities as possible to these advanced learners. Okay, maybe we have time for another question. ではもう一問、聞いてみます。アドバンスラーナーの客観的な指標はあるのでしょうかということで、こちら最後の質問にさせていただきます。Amy, please answer this question.
Sure. So I will say, assessing advanced learners to me is the $1 million question. We have tools, as I mentioned in the talk, we have tools that seem to work well, have operated well for years on students who have had a lot of educational opportunity. But really, when it comes down to assessment, the first thing we always have to ask is assessment for what? So is it assessment to get into a particular type of program, or is it assessment so we can design around that student's needs? And I think for students who have had access, the standardized tests are still probably one of the best tools for it. If you can do well on those, there's a pretty good chance you'll do well in the opportunities that are provided. The challenge comes in if you have a student who has any reasons why standardized tests might not work. So we know there are cultural biases. We know that students who might be in that twice exceptional have some sort of learning challenge but are advanced. Students who have other kinds of non-traditional impairments, those students may or may not be able to show it on a standardized test. And so there it comes down to kind of watching and waiting to see what happens. There are some kinds of holistic assessments for parents who can afford it. So there are good psychological testing organizations really all over the world that do this kind of assessment. But I think the first question is, what do you want to assess for? Most of the time, it does require something that takes you above grade level to really see these students. And so that's why right now our strongest tools are still these above grade tests. They're best when they are in specific domains so that you can differentiate what type of advanced learner. But that's, this is, I think, where the field needs needs the most work and has a lot of really opportunity to do it. And so stay tuned because we're working on this.
Thank you, thank you. And we are running out of time, but we have another quick question. 日本で今後 CTY のプログラムは行われる予定はありますか？という質問です。これだけお答えいただきますでしょうか？ So, Amy, can you answer if you have any plans CTY in Japan?
Sure. So in the very near future, we're trying really hard to really think about how our domestic programming has a global feel, right? So the U.S. programming, but we are always looking at opportunities to take our programming elsewhere. And we are thinking about things like partnering programs where rather than us running our full program somewhere, we actually partner with organizations. We're not quite there yet, but we're working on it. And then the question about online programming is one we've wrestled with. So we actually do have a large number of students coming from East Asia, including Japan. And we continue to wrestle with the time zone issue because we do feel that the time with instructor and with peers is important, and we're going to continue to increase that even in our online space. And we have done a lot of work trying to nail the time zones down. We've asked what people prefer. We've still had some challenges enrolling, but I'm very interested in what people would find as the best time zones for their students. And then the challenge is on us to have instructors and other students who can be available. So we have been working on this. We continue to work on it, and I'm excited to see someone's interested because that motivates us to keep at it.
So we look forward to hear lots of more information from CityY in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for answering lots of questions. そして皆様、たくさんの質問ありがとうございます。今後の質問について、いただいた質問については、後ほど、参加いただいた皆様のメールアドレスに、なるべくお答えして、お返ししていきたいと思いますので、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。では、次にこの冬に当団体で開催するプログラムについて、事業開発担当の飯田より説明させていただきます。飯田さん、よろしくお願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。たくさんのご質問ありがとうございました。ここからはエデュケーションビヨンド、我々の今後の活動について3つ、あと1つ、我々の運営メンバーを募集というところをご案内いたします。まず1つ目です。先ほど原よりご紹介もありましたビヨンドスクール、これの冬休み特別プログラムを東京、長野で同時開催する予定です。これまで2022年の冬から3回にわたって自由研究プログラムというものを実施させていただきました。過去の反省であったりとか学び、これを踏まえて大きくパワーアップしたビヨンドスクール、こちらを2023年の冬休みの期間中に実施いたします。前回までと同様、アドバンスラーナーの小学生、もしくは場合によっては中学生がご自身で探求したいテーマをそれぞれ持ち寄っていただき、チューター、社会人であったり大学生、大学院生のチューターと一緒にとことん深掘っていくスタイルを踏襲していきます。また特にですね、東京、長野、それぞれ対面のイベントの日というものがあります。ここで、すみません、前のページでお願いします。はい、ここで、チューターと、一緒にその自分の自由研究のテーマっていうのを深掘りすると同時に、他の参加者との交流というのをぜひ図っていただきたいと思っています。次お願いします。期間につきましては、東京は2023年10月の10日日曜日から開始されて、1月の7日日曜日までになっております。冬休みプラスアルファぐらいの期間だとご理解ください。長野においては12月17日から1月の14日で実施予定です。ともにすべて日本語でのプログラムになる予定です。応募締め切りにつきましては、少し早く東京11月10日金曜日、長野11月17日金曜日となっております。次のページお願いします。ご興味持っていただけた方に関しましては、ぜひ、我々の団体のウェブページ、お知らせ一覧にこれらのプログラムの詳細がございますので、ご確認ください。ご応募の内容であったりとか、締め切りに関しましても、こちらのウェブページ上で随時更新してまいりますので、こちらをご確認いただけますようお願いいたします。こちらの QR コードを読み取っていただければ、ウェブページにも飛びますが、Google などでエデュケーションビヨンドというふうに調べていただいて、右上のお知らせ一覧のタブから飛んでいただくことも可能です。ぜひ、特にお子さんがご参加したいということであれば、ご応募お待ちしております。 次お願いします。で、今回、CTY の、エイミー博士から講演いただきました。また、11月の11日に、今度は長野県の、先生におかれまして、別のアドバンスラーナーについての説明会を開催していただく予定です。この冬の自由研究型プログラムビヨンドスクールを開催する予定の長野県における参加者だけではなく、ここでは東京であったり、他の地域の参加者もぜひご参加いただければと思っています。ゲストとしまして、この分野の専門家である上越教育大学の住谷先生をお呼びする予定です。でまた、この、説明会の中で、冬休み特別プログラム、ビヨンドスクールについても詳しくご説明をする予定です。もし参加を検討されている方は、ぜひご参加いただければと思います。次お願いします。こちらにつきましても、同じくお知らせ一覧から辿っていただくことが可能です。日時は11月11日土曜日、これのお昼13時30分から14時30分、オンラインでの開催予定です。基本は長野県の方を対象にはしていますが、内容としても、特に長野県の方に限定するものではございませんので、ぜひ、長野県在住以外の方もふるってご参加いただければと思います。次お願いします。はい、3つ目のお知らせです。本日ご紹介したようなイベントの告知であったりとか、過去のプログラムの参加者の体験談などを、都度我々の SNS 上で発信しております。Facebook、Twitter 今運営しておりますので、ぜひフォローいただいて、情報を取っていただければと思います。次お願いします。はい、こちら最後です。我々エデュケーションビヨンド運営を基本的にはプロボの社会人経験のあるプロフェッショナルがボランティアでするという形で運営させていただいております。で今後、活動拡大というものを見据えて団体の運営メンバーを募集しております。もしご関心をお寄せいただける方いらっしゃいましたら、UR コード、もしくはお知らせ一覧のところからぜひご登録いただいてご連絡いただければと思います。対象業務の一覧としましては、こちらに記載のあります通り、オペレーション、例えばマーケティングであったり、IT、経理などがございます。それ以外にも、ビヨンドスクール、もしくは他のプログラムのイベント、企画、運営、あとは全体の戦略、プロジェクトマネジメントなどが対象になってまいります。主な会議として、水曜日に1時間、ウィークリーのチェックポイントを設けております。これ以外、担当の案件次第で適宜ミーティングを実施しております。こちら、強制の参加というわけではないので、もしご興味あって、私こういう形で参加したいですというものがあれば、ぜひご連絡いただければと思います。はい、次お願いします。はい、私からは以上です。ここからじゃあ、服部に戻します。
はい、飯田さんありがとうございます。皆様日曜の朝から、ご参加いただきありがとうございます。今後の活動に生かしていくため、本日のイベントについてのアンケートにお答えいただけますでしょうか。ご覧の QR コードからリンク先に飛んでください。そして簡単なものですので、今、この時間にお答えいただけると大変嬉しく思います。1分ほど時間を取りますので、ご記入お願いします。アンケートは非常に簡単なものですので、ぜひ皆さん、お答えいただけると嬉しいです。アンケートについては、この後もご回答いただきます。引き続き、QR コードの方からリンク先に飛んで、お答えいただけますようお願いいたします。本日は改めまして日曜日の朝から、たくさんの皆様にご参加いただきました。大変ありがとうございます。なお、今後、当団体へのお問い合わせは、ホームページなどから受け付けております。疑問点、不明な点、また今後のプログラムについての質問などあれば、ぜひ、ホームページのメールアドレスよりご連絡ください。イベントはこちらで全て終了となります。右下の退出ボタンからご退出ください。ご清聴大変ありがとうございました。本日はプロボのメンバーの運営にて至らない点もあったと思いますが、 これからもエデュケーションビヨンドの活動へのご理解とご支援をどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。本日は大変ありがとうございました。